Get out of my kitchen. That's what my daughter-in-law said to me on Thanksgiving morning. Not asked, not suggested, told me. Like I was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. Like I hadn't owned that kitchen for 31 years. I stood there holding a ceramic dish, the one my wife had used every single Thanksgiving until the day she passed, and I didn't say a word. I set the dish down on the counter, walked out of the kitchen, and sat in my armchair in the living room. My son, Mitchell, was standing right there. He saw the whole thing. He looked at the floor. That was the moment I knew something had to change. Let me back up. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer for the county, retired at 62 with a pension and enough savings that I didn't have to worry. My wife Carol died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. We had one son, Mitchell. We poured everything into that boy. Not just money, though we did that too. Time, attention. The kind of presence that I think a lot of fathers in my generation were good at, but Carol made sure I showed up. Little League, science fairs, helping him move into 3 different apartments before he finally bought a place of his own. When Mitchell met Renee, I tried to like her. I really did. She was sharp, organized, ambitious. Mitchell was smitten from the first month. They dated 2 years, got married, and moved about 40 minutes away. Carol was still alive then, and she hosted the wedding dinner at our house. Everything seemed fine. Then Carol got sick. I won't go into all of it, because even now it's hard to talk about. What I'll say is this. Renee was not around much during those 14 months. Mitchell came when he could, but Renee always had something. A work thing. A prior commitment. When Carol was in hospice during the final 3 weeks, Renee visited once. Once. For about 45 minutes. I didn't say anything. Carol told me not to make it a thing, so I didn't. After Carol died, the grief was something I hadn't prepared for, even though I'd had 14 months to prepare. The house felt enormous. Quiet in a way that had a sound to it, if that makes sense. I started going to bed early just to make the day shorter. My neighbor, a retired teacher named June, would check on me. A couple of guys from my old work crew called. But mostly I was alone. About 8 months after Carol's passing, Mitchell called with an idea. He and Renee were expecting their first child. They were running out of space in their house. Money was tight. Mitchell worked in project management. Renee was in marketing, and they bought more house than they should have during the boom years. Mitchell said it might make sense, financially and practically, if they moved in with me. Temporarily. Just until they got their footing, got the baby settled, figure out their next step. The baby would be good for me, he said. It would give me something to focus on. I said yes. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't just loneliness, though that was part of it. It was Mitchell. When he asked me, there was something in his voice, something that reminded me of when he was about 9 years old and needed help building a model bridge for a school project. That specific kind of need. I couldn't say no to that. They moved in 6 weeks later. The first month was fine, better than fine. The house had life in it again. Mitchell and I would watch football on Sunday afternoons. Renee was still pregnant and mostly pleasant, a little distracted. When my granddaughter Abby was born in February, I was at the hospital. I held her about an hour after she arrived. She was small and pink and perfect. For a while, everything was good. I don't know exactly when the shift happened. It was gradual. The wave rust spreads. You don't see it until it's already through the metal. Renee started making comments about the house, small ones at first. The kitchen layout wasn't efficient. The guest bathroom tile was outdated. The backyard was wasted space. I nodded and said things like, "You might be right," or "something to think about." I didn't want conflict. I was aware that having a new baby is stressful, and I gave a lot of grace. Then the comments became decisions. Renee rearranged the kitchen while I was at my Monday morning coffee group. When I came home, my cast iron pans, Carol's cast iron pans, actually ones she'd had since before we were married, were in a box by the back door. Renee said they were too heavy and took up too much space. She bought new non-stick pans and they were already in the cabinet. I took the cast iron pans out of the box and put them back. Renee didn't say anything that day, but something shifted in her face. A few weeks later, I came downstairs on a Saturday morning and found a woman I didn't know measuring the dining room. Renee was with her. Renee explained very casually that she was thinking about opening up the wall between the dining room and the living room to create better flow. The woman was a contractor. Renee had called her on her own. About my house, I said as calmly as I could manage that I hadn't agreed to any renovations and that I would appreciate being consulted before contractors were brought into my home. Renee looked at me the way you look at someone who doesn't understand something obvious. She said she was just exploring options. She said I should be glad someone was taking an interest in improving the house. Mitchell was in the room. He said my name once, Dad, and then nothing else. That was a pattern I would see again and again over the next several months. Mitchell would start to say something, and then he wouldn't. He'd look at Renee, then at the floor, then leave the room. I understood, in some sense. Renee was strong-willed, and Mitchell had always avoided confrontation. I'd seen that since he was a teenager. But understanding it didn't make it easier to watch. By the time Abby was 9 months old, Renee was running the household. She decided what was cooked, when, and how. She set a schedule for when visitors could come, which effectively limited my friends from stopping by because it interfered with Abby's sleep schedule. She started referring to the guest room as the nursery and suggested I move my home office to the basement so the room next to the nursery could be a playroom. I moved my office to the basement. I'm still not sure why I did that. Looking back, I think I convinced myself that it was temporary, that I was being a good grandfather by being flexible, that Mitchell would eventually find his footing and the balance would shift back. I kept waiting for that moment. It didn't come. What came instead was Thanksgiving. My daughter, my son's wife, had invited her parents, her sister, and 2 of her work friends to Thanksgiving dinner. At my house, she mentioned it to me 4 days before, not as something she was asking, but as something she was informing me of. I was fine with company. I like a full table at Thanksgiving, always have, but I asked if I could cook the turkey. Carol and I had always done a dry-brined bird, specific herbs, a method we'd refined over about 15 years. It was the one tradition I felt most strongly about. Renee said she had a different recipe she wanted to try, a spatchcock turkey. She'd seen it on a cooking show. I said we could do both, her spatchcock bird and my traditional one. She said that was wasteful and unnecessary. I dropped it. But Thanksgiving morning, I woke up early and started on my turkey anyway. The dry brine needed at least a few hours to work. I was at the counter, mixing herbs, rosemary, thyme, a little smoked paprika, the exact blend Carol had written on an index card that I still keep in the kitchen drawer, when Renee came downstairs. She saw what I was doing. She looked at the turkey, then at me. "Frank," she said, "I already told you. I'm handling the turkey this year. Please put that back and get out of my kitchen." My kitchen. I put down the dish. I walked to the armchair. Mitchell came in about 20 minutes later and asked if I wanted coffee. I said no. He sat down across from me for a minute, not saying anything, then went back to the kitchen. Renee's parents arrived at noon. Her sister. The work friends. They all settled in like they owned the place, like it was Renee's house, and I was the guest who'd been permitted to stay. Renee moved through the kitchen with complete authority. She'd moved my index card out of the drawer. I found it later on the counter, tucked behind the paper towel holder. That was when I went upstairs, sat on the edge of my bed, and made a decision. I need you to understand something. I am not a confrontational person. I spent my career managing projects, resolving disputes, keeping people working together. I know how to be patient. But I also know how to plan. I know how to assess a situation, identify what needs to happen, and execute it step by step. That's what I did for 32 years. And sitting on that bed on Thanksgiving afternoon, while my daughter-in-law entertained guests in my house and my son looked at the floor, I decided to apply those same skills to what was happening in my own home. I ate Thanksgiving dinner at my own table. I was polite. I made conversation with Renee's parents, who were perfectly nice people. I ate the spatchcock turkey, which was fine. Afterward, I did the dishes. And then I started making calls. The first call was to my attorney, a man named Glenn Farber, who had handled Carol's estate and who I'd known for 20 years. I explained the situation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said 4 words. "You have options, Frank." Glenn walked me through what those options looked like. Because the house was solely in my name, paid off, no mortgage, valued currently at around $640,000. I had complete legal authority over it. Mitchell and Renee had no tenancy agreement, no lease, nothing in writing. They were guests. Guests could be asked to leave with proper notice under state law, 30 days written notice in my state. The second call was to my financial advisor, a woman I'd worked with for 12 years. I asked her to review all accounts and confirm that Mitchell and Renee had no access to anything in my name. They didn't. I never added them. I also asked her to move my primary savings into a new account at a different institution, just to be clean and clear. The third call was to a real estate agent I knew from the neighborhood, not to sell the house, just to understand what it would rent for if I wanted to take that route. The number she gave me was more than I expected. Then I waited. Not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to do this right. I gave myself 3 weeks to observe, to document, and to prepare. I wrote things down. Dates. Specific incidents. Not out of anger, but because I have an engineer's instinct to document. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday evening, I sat Mitchell down in the living room. Renee was putting Abby to bed. I told Mitchell that this situation wasn't working. I told him I wanted him to hear it from me directly, privately, before anything else happened. I told him that I loved him and that I would always be his father, but that I needed my home back. Mitchell stared at me. He said he hadn't realized it had gotten that bad. I showed him my notes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that Renee had mentioned some tension, but that she'd framed it as me being difficult to live with, resistant to change. He said he'd taken her word for it. For I told him I understood. I told him I wasn't asking him to choose sides. I was telling him that regardless of anything else, I needed him and Renee and Abby to make other arrangements, and that I was giving 30 days written notice effective the following day. He nodded slowly. He said, "Okay, Dad," and then he went upstairs. I slid the written notice under their bedroom door that night because my attorney had advised putting everything in writing from that point forward. Renee came downstairs the next morning with a look on her face that I recognized. She was preparing for a fight. She stood in the kitchen doorway and told me that she thought what I was doing was cruel, that she had a baby, that they had nowhere to go, that I was punishing her for trying to make this house functional, and that Mitchell was going to be devastated. I let her finish. Then I said, "Renee, you have 30 days. I'd like us to use them well." She left the room. The next 30 days were not comfortable. Renee barely spoke to me. Mitchell was quiet and clearly torn, but they started looking for apartments. I could hear the conversations, could see the browser tabs when Mitchell left his laptop open on the couch. They found a place about 20 minutes away, a rental, a reasonable size. They started packing in the third week. What I didn't expect was Renee's parents getting involved. Her mother called me one afternoon. She was polite but pointed. She said she felt I was being unreasonable, that families should support each other, that putting out a young mother and baby was not something a good man did. I listened. When she was done, I said, "I hear you and I understand why you see it that way. But this is my home and I have to live in a way I can live with." She said she hoped I'd reconsider. I said I wouldn't. Her father actually came to the house. He knocked on the door and asked if we could talk. I invited him in. He was more direct than his wife. He said he thought Renee had overstepped and that he told her so. He also said Mitchell needed to be more of a man about the situation. I appreciated his honesty. We talked for almost an hour. He left shaking my hand. The 30th day came. Mitchell and Renee moved out on a Saturday with the help of a moving company. I offered to help. They declined. When the last box was in the truck, Mitchell came and found me in the backyard. I was sitting in one of the lawn chairs, watching the November light come through the oak trees. He sat down next to me. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I should have handled things differently." I told him I loved him. I told him I wanted him in my life and I wanted to know Abby. I told him that nothing that had happened changed any of that. He cried a little. He's not much of a crier, never has been, but right there in the backyard he did. We sat together for about 20 minutes. Then he went and got in the truck. The house that evening was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of after Carol. This was a quiet that felt like mine. I walked through every room. I put Carol's cast iron pans back on the rack where they belonged. I found her index card, still behind the paper towel holder, and I put it back in the kitchen drawer. Then I went and sat in my armchair. A few months have passed since then. Mitchell and I talk every week. He came over for dinner last month and brought Abby, and I held her in that same armchair, and she grabbed my finger and wouldn't let go. Renee didn't come, and that's okay. Maybe someday, maybe not. What matters is Mitchell is still my son and Abby knows her grandfather. I've started hosting Sunday dinners again. Just small things, June from next door, a couple of the guys from my old crew. The dining room wall is still intact, the kitchen is mine again, and next Thanksgiving, I'm making my turkey. The dry brined one. Carol's herbs. The index card back in the drawer where it belongs. Where are you listening from? And I want to ask you something honestly. If you were in my position, how long would you have waited before doing what I did? I've thought a lot about what made all of this possible. Not the legal steps, not the 30-day notice, not the phone calls to Glenn or my financial advisor. Those were just mechanics. What made it possible was something that took me a long time to build, and that I almost let slip away without realizing it. When Renee said, "Get out of my kitchen," she wasn't just being rude. She was testing something. She'd been testing it for months, actually. Every rearranged cabinet, every contractor she invited in without asking, every time she said something dismissive and waited to see what I would do. And for a long time, what I did was nothing. I nodded. I walked out of the room. I moved my office to the basement. I told myself I was being flexible, being a good grandfather, keeping the peace. But what I was actually doing was showing her over and over that there were no consequences, that I could be managed, that my own home wasn't really mine if she decided otherwise. That's the part I have to be honest about. I didn't end up in that situation because Renee was a bad person. I ended up there because I stopped acting like a man who understood the value of what he built. 31 years in that house. Carol's kitchen, a mortgage paid off with 32 years of work. I had every right in the world to stand in that kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, and I gave it up without a fight because I was afraid of conflict. That's not grace. That's not patience. That's just fear, wearing a polite mask. What changed on Thanksgiving afternoon wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that. I sat on the edge of that bed and I wasn't furious. I was clear. There's a difference. Anger makes you want to react. Clarity makes you want to think. And what I thought was, I have a choice here. I can keep waiting for something to change on its own, or I can use what I actually know, how to assess a problem, how to plan, how to execute, and I can change it myself. That's what I did. And here's what I learned from it. The outcomes we live with are almost always the outcomes we allowed, not because we deserved them, but because we didn't make a different decision soon enough. Mitchell let things go too long. I let things go too long. We both paid for that in different ways. But I also learned something about repair. Mitchell sitting next to me in the backyard that Saturday. That happened because I did the hard thing cleanly and without cruelty. I didn't try to punish anyone. I didn't make speeches. I gave notice. I was consistent. And when it was over, I told my son I loved him. That left a door open, and Abby grabbing my finger in that armchair a few months later. That's the door I walked through. The choices you make when things are hard are the ones that determine what you still have when the hard part is over. That's not a complicated idea, but it took me 67 years and one very long Thanksgiving to really understand it.